Hello and welcome to the deployment video of the Dataforce component Publisher. This instruction guide will show you how to easily set up all the necessary resources in order to deploy Publisher. If you haven't already watched the initial setup video for Dataforce, be sure to check it out prior to following this video and make sure that your GCP environment is set up accordingly. Publisher has several prerequisites and configuration requirements that need to be met before it can be deployed to the Kubernetes cluster created in the initial setup video. Quick disclaimer, considering that one of the prerequisites mentioned in the continuation of this video, more specifically the Google Managed SSL certificates, can take up to 72 hours to get provisioned by Google, the prerequisites will not be directly met in the video, but the video will demonstrate how they can be met. The first step is to reserve 2 static external IP addresses. For this, go to your working project selected on the GCP console, navigate to the VPC network service, and click on IP addresses in the left side pane. Once there, click on the Reserve External Static Address button in the top header. Here, choose a global IPv4 address, appropriately named Publisher Manager IP, and click on Reserve. Now, repeat this process once again by reserving a global IPv4 address appropriately named Publisher Web UI IP. Alternatively, this step can be performed by running the following gcloud commands. Let's copy these values to a notepad file or anywhere else in the background, since they will be needed in the next step. The second step is to create the DNS records. In order to create the DNS records, you need to have a domain registered with a domain provider. If you don't have a domain, you can always register one with a domain registrar. Here, Cloud DNS will be used to manage DNS records in your domain. If you choose to skip this step, you will need to create these records directly in your domain hosting service. Let's navigate to Network Services, and in the left side pane, click on Cloud DNS. Here you create a new public zone by clicking on Create Zone. Input an appropriate name for your zone, the DNS name, and click on Create. Once created, click on the NS type record created with the zone. Copy the 4 name server names mentioned in the list below. At this point, you will have to go to your domain registrar and replace your default name servers with the ones copied from the created Cloud DNS zone. This part is not shown in the video, since it varies from domain registrar to domain registrar. Once those changes are propagated, all records created in the Cloud DNS zone will be created in the domain registrar. In our case, as mentioned before, regarding the prerequisites, the Cloud DNS zone has already been created and set up, so that one will be used for the purposes of this video. It is important to note here that the DNS zone used does not have to reside in the same GCP project as the static IP addresses generated, hence why we are able to use the DNS zone from a different GCP project here. Once inside the zone, click on Add Standard. This will add a standard record set to your domain. After inputting an appropriate name, for example, Publisher Manager, and the IPv4 address that you copied previously from Publisher Manager IP, click on Create. Once again, repeat this process for the Publisher Web UI DNS record using the IPv4 copied previously from Publisher Web UI IP. Alternatively, This step can be performed by running the following gcloud commands. Once both are created, copy the full DNS names since they will be used in the next step. The third step is to create a couple of Google Managed SSL certificates. Within the working project where the static IP addresses reside, navigate again to Network Services and in the left side pane, click on Load Balancing. The default page view doesn't enable you to edit certificates, so click on the Load Balancing Link Components view to switch the view to display the load balancing resources. Select the Certificates tab and click on Create SSL Certificate. Here, select a Google Managed Certificate, appropriately named Publisher Manager Cert, input the manager DNS name copied in the previous step in the domain field, and click on Create. Repeat this process one more time for the Publisher WebUI cert, using the WebUI DNS name in the domain field. Alternatively, this step can be performed by running the following gcloud commands. This is a step which was mentioned before as the one taking up the most time, up to 72 hours, so be sure not to lose hope too soon that something went wrong before the certificates get provisioned by Google. The fourth step consists of several smaller steps needed in order to enable authentication and encryption of data. Firstly, you will need credentials, username and password, for the Postgres metadata database. This database will be used as the so-called metadata database, where information about the different publisher source systems, destination brokers, instances, along with some other information as well, will be stored. The password used here must contain at least 9 characters, of which there are 2 uppercase letters, 2 lowercase letters, and 2 numbers. Secondly, generate a 32-byte encryption key using a random key generator, or use the default one, for messages extracted by publisher. Thirdly, generate a 16-byte JWT encryption key for secure communication, or use the default one. With this step, the necessary prerequisites for deploying the simplest version of the publisher component have been met. There are additional prerequisites that can be met in order to enable additional features. Firstly, in order to integrate Publisher with the Datafoss component schema registry, the user needs to pass its IP address or the service name to the variable schema validation URL in the Publisher YAML file, which will be further discussed in the configuration part of the deployment. This value can be obtained by running the following command once the schema registry component has been deployed to the Kubernetes cluster mentioned in the initial setup video. Secondly, if the user wishes to publish messages to a pub/sub topic, more specifically use pub/sub as a destination message broker, a service account with the necessary permissions is required. This service account has been generated in the initial setup video. In order to enable it, simply position yourself in the same directory where the deployment and the key.json files are stored and run the following command. This will create a Kubernetes secret named pub/sub key from the generated key.json file. The last step in order to deploy Publisher is to configure the values that need to be provided by the user by editing the Publisher YAML deployment file. We will now go over all of the required values in the file that have to be modified in order to enable the deployment to work. On the left-hand side, you can see the value which is stored in the Publisher YAML file by default And on the right-hand side, you can see the type of value which should replace the default value. Firstly, we have the Postgres DB, Postgres user, Postgres password variables. These hold the values for the name of the Postgres database, username, and password respectively. The values mentioned here as Postgres user and Postgres password are the same ones which need to be inputted further on for the metadata username and metadata password. The next value which needs to be entered is the ENC key 1, which is nothing more than the 32-byte encryption key generated in the Prerequisites section. The value after that one is the Web UI, where you copy the Web UI domain. After that, the next value that needs to be modified is the JWT secret, where you enter the 16-byte JWT encryption key generated in the Prerequisites section. The next value which needs to be modified is the kubernetes.io/ingress.global static IP name. Here is where the manager's static IP address name goes. The variable right after that one, the ingress.gcp.kubernetes.io/pre-shared search, requires the name of the manager's Google managed SSL certificate. A couple of lines below that, under host, is where the manager's domain name goes. Moving on, the next value which can be modified, which is optional as mentioned before, is the schema validation URL. This is where the schema registry's URL goes if the schema registry component is deployed, or an empty string otherwise. Next stop, the data.server.properties.window.manager endpoint is where you copy the manager's domain. The last few values which need to be modified are the kubernetes.io/ingress.global static IP name, the ingress.gcp.kubernetes.io/pre-shared cert, and the host. A few lines below that, where you enter the Web UI static IP address name, the name of the Web UI Google Managed SSL certificate, and the Web UI domain name respectively. Apart from these required values, there are additional parameters which need to be set if one wishes to use Publisher with several of its destination brokers. The CA cert, client cert, and client key presents the CA TLS certificate, the client TLS certificate, and the client TLS private key respectively, which are needed to either set up Kafka or NATS with TLS required. Once all of these values are entered, you can now apply the Publisher deployment file by positioning yourself in the directory with the deployment files and running the following command. Once all the resources are created, as with any deployment, we will have to wait a couple of minutes in order for the pods and ingresses to become healthy. Their statuses can be checked by going to the Kubernetes Engine service, clicking on Services and Ingress on the left side pane, and then clicking on the Ingress tab. Here, choose in the drop-down menus above the tabs the correct cluster and namespace where your deployment has been deployed. After positioning yourselves correctly, you should be able to see two ingresses here, Publisher Manager Ingress and the Publisher Web UI Ingress. Once their status is registered as OK, you can then click on the Publisher Manager Syntio XYZ link, which should display an empty site with the status being healthy, meaning that the Manager component is working fine. You can also click on the Publisher Web UI Syntio XYZ link, which should display the Publisher's Web UI, where you will be prompted with the login screen of the Web UI component. More on how to manage and use Publisher by leveraging its web UI will be covered in the following use case video. Thank you so much for watching this video, and we will see you next time.